All right, well, we're going to talk about one of the most important topics we can talk about, peace and violence in Christianity and Islam. We're including Christianity here because, as you know, we have terrorist attacks. And after every terrorist attack, if we start trying to examine the ideology of the terrorists, and we find teachings that call for terrorism in the Muslim sources, and we bring those up and we say, you see, there's a problem here. It's very common to respond, well, there have been violent Christians too, but there's violence in the Bible. So aren't you being hypocritical for bringing this up? And so we're going to start off by looking at violence in the Bible so that we make sure we're not being inconsistent here. Right? If we're examining Muslim sources, we want to be consistent. We don't want to apply different standards to different belief systems, because if you apply different standards, you can come up with any conclusion you want. So we want to be consistent here. And we want to make sure we wouldn't apply a standard to Islam that we wouldn't also apply to Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or anything else. So we'll start with Christianity. Now, it's very odd after a terrorist attack for Christians to hear, well, Christians have been violent too, because we're thinking, well, we know what kind of things Jesus and his followers said. And so we'd be thinking of things like these. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." So here Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. This would have been a really good time to say, chop your enemies' heads off, if he was trying to convey a message of violence here. Later, if there was ever a time to defend Jesus with violence, it would be when people are coming to take him away. Soldiers are coming after him. So Matthew 26, then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. Best chance ever to defend Jesus with violence. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." So, the best time ever to defend Jesus with violence, and Jesus says, put your sword back into its place. He's then taken to his trial, where he's confronted by Pilate. And Jesus says to him, John 18:36, "My kingdom," because if you're a Roman leader, your main concern is this guy going to start a violent revolution? That's your main concern. And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Notice what he says. If my kingdom were an earthly kingdom, then my followers would be fighting to save me. But it's not an earthly kingdom. That's why they're not fighting for me. So this is what we find when we look at the teachings of Jesus, and we see the impact he had on his followers. We'll just look at some quotations from the Apostle Paul here. And the reason I include teachings from the Apostle Paul here is Paul starts off as violent, right? Remember, Paul starts off as I heard one preacher refer to Paul as the original Osama bin Laden. I have to impose what I want on you through violence. And then Paul eventually becomes a Christian. And so here's a guy we know at one point believed in getting his will done through violent means, and yet something changes. So Romans 12:17, he says, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone." 12:18, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men." Notice, not just be at peace with your fellow Christians. 12:19, "Never take your own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God." 12:20, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink." 1 Corinthians 16:14, "Let all that you do be done in love." 2 Corinthians 10, "Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses." Notice, we do not war according to the flesh. Sounds like Jesus when he's saying his kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. That's why his followers don't fight like that. Ephesians 5:2, walk in love. 1 Thessalonians 3, may the Lord cause you to increase and abound in love for one another and for all people. 1 Thessalonians 5, see that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people. 1 Timothy 2, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men. Now notice the underlined portions there, for all people, on behalf of all men. This is not, hey, be nice to your fellow Christians. Wish well upon your fellow Christians. You seek the good of all men. So, if these are the kinds of things we're thinking of when we think of what does Christianity tell us to do, then it would sound very odd to say, but Christianity also has its violence, and Christianity is also violent, or all religions teach the same thing about peace and violence. Sound very strange to a Christian, but there's basically three ways that a critic can sort of saddle Christianity with being violent as well. So three basic approaches here. One, you can cite a violent command from the Old Testament and claim that it's also a command for Christians. So Joshua, go fight the Canaanites, cross the River Jordan, go fight them. Say, aha, there you have it. They're going and they're commanded to fight. I've never met a Christian who says, oh, aha, Joshua was commanded to cross the River Jordan and fight the Canaanites. I better travel to Israel, cross the River Jordan, and go start fighting Canaanites. We would normally understand that that is a command directed towards Joshua, and that other commands, like Old Testament laws about various penalties, various punishments for various crimes, that those would be part of a specific covenant. The Old Testament, there are a series of, throughout the Bible, there are a series of covenants. There's a covenant with Noah. Covenant's an agreement between God and men. You do this and I'll do this. And there's a covenant with Noah. There's a covenant with Abraham. There's a covenant with Moses and the children of Israel. And then there is the new covenant. And that's the covenant that we're under. So the Bible is a series of covenants. We believe all these covenants are from God. We're all revealed by God. But Christianity is one particular covenant. There, it's a certain covenant. And different covenants have different rules associated with them. So Adam was told only eat plants. Wasn't allowed to eat animals. Later, Noah, there's a covenant with Noah, he's told eat anything you want. The covenant with Moses, the children of Israel, that's you can eat certain things. You can't eat other things. And so there are different rules associated with different covenants. So if we're talking about the Christian covenant, that would be the commands given to Christians by Jesus and his followers. And so it would be very odd to say, look, here's this Old Testament command, even though you, Christian, are commanded to live in peace with all men, to love everyone, there's this command about fighting the Canaanites, and therefore you're violent. That would seem strange. Now, just to be clear, as Christians, Christians believe that the Old Testament is revelation, so it's very important under certain circumstances to actually discuss those passages. Especially if you believe that this is God's final revelation for people. Well, how do you deal with these Old Testament passages, some of which would make you go, ooh, it's kind of rough. It's kind of rough there. What are we going to do about that? Important conversation to have, but as far as being a command for Christians, it's just not. So that really wouldn't apply here. In other words, if you read the Bible from beginning to end, there are tons of commands directed towards various groups. If you finish reading the Bible all the way through, and you pause and say, now what am I commanded as a Christian? You would say, my final marching orders are, and then you would list them. And so we're thinking in terms of final marching orders. If you read the book from beginning to end, what are you called to do now? And it's not to cross the River Jordan and fight the Canaanites. Next, you can twist the meaning of a New Testament passage. So you can twist the meaning of some teaching that is part of the Christian covenant, that is directed towards you. And you can say, you see this? This is calling for violence. And the most common one I've seen over about the past 15 years, which I see multiple times every day, when people send me this and say, you see, this is a command calling for violence. And there's a reason. Didn't hear this before then. It was actually popularized by Muslim apologists Ahmed Deedat and Zakir Naik, who said that Luke 19:27, in Luke 19:27, Jesus commands his followers, as for those enemies of mine who did not want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them in front of me. And so now people who've taken Ahmed Deedat and Zakir Naik as their models now all run around using this argument, saying, aha, Jesus said right there, Luke 19:27. And you can open up the Bible, red letter edition. Red letter means it's the words of Jesus, and you look there, and in red letters, it says, as for those enemies who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Unless you, of course, read the entire passage, as I see some of you smiling because you've read the passage. That's actually a parable. Jesus starts a parable in verse 12, and he says, there's a ruler who went away to receive the kingdom and so on. He comes back, and the ruler in the story says, at the end, after his subjects have rebelled against him, the ruler returns in the story and says, as for those enemies of mine who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. So is this Jesus commanding his followers to go on a killing spree? No, and no Christian has ever interpreted it that way. And so when someone says, aha, that's what he's saying, usually it's someone doing it out of ignorance. So when people tell me on a daily basis, Jesus called on his followers to go on a killing spree there, I normally think they're not trying to deceive me. They've just been duped by Zakir Naik or Ahmed Deedat. But Zakir Naik and Ahmed Deedat, I believe, have read that entire passage. And so that I would regard as deception. If someone's read the passage and they still say that this is Jesus calling on people to go on a killing spree, that's a different story, because now you know what he's saying and you're deliberately distorting it. But, so, you can twist the meaning of New Testament passages, but I've never seen a passage that's actually calling upon Christians to do any violence when you actually read it. The important takeaway there, though, is context is important. Whether you're examining the Bible or the Qur'an, it's very easy to take any message in the world and distort the meaning by pulling something out of context. For instance, in the course of me talking right now, I said the words, as for those enemies of mine who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them in front of me. You could delete everything else I said and say, look, you could post a YouTube video, David Wood calling on people to slaughter everyone, right? You can rip my words out of context. And you can do that with the Bible. And you can do that with the Quran. So, to be consistent, we want to make sure we don't do that with the Quran. And third, you can point to the violent Christians. So, there has been tons of violence over the centuries by Christians, wars. Christians were involved with the slave trade. Christians were involved with oppression of various groups. So you can look at them and say, you see, Christians do the same thing. Well, yes, people of all groups do the same things. That doesn't mean the ideologies behind them call for the same things. And so, if a Christian is doing something that has nothing to do with Christianity or is even opposed to Christianity, you can say, that's a bad Christian. What a bad person and a bad Christian. You don't say, Christianity is bad for teaching that if it doesn't actually teach that. And we would want to apply that same standard to Islam. We don't want to point to Muslims and say, look at what these Muslims are doing. They're committing this violence. Islam is awful for teaching this, if it's not something that Islam teaches. So, to be consistent, here are the ways that people could criticize Christianity and call Christianity violent. Cite a violent command from the Old Testament, pretend that it's also a command for Christians. We don't want to do that. So if the Quran, for instance, said, Abraham did this violent thing, if it's not a command to Muslims, we shouldn't say, hey, this is a command for Muslims or something like that. And likewise, we don't want to take things out of context, and we don't want to point to Muslims for doing things that the Quran also doesn't command. So that would be pretty consistent if we examine Islam in light of that, right? So we'll do that, and I don't know how much anyone knows about Islam, and I have a habit of, I'll be talking about various things, and someone will come up to me afterwards and say, what's that Quran that you kept mentioning? And so I'll try and define a few terms here at the beginning. Allah, that's an Arabic word that means the God, so is the Arabic word for the God of monotheism. Islam is a word that means submission or surrender. So that tells you how important submission is in Islam, that the entire religion is named after submission. And in its theological religious context, it refers to submission to Allah. So Islam is the religion or the ideology. The person who follows it is a Muslim. A Muslim is one who submits. Again, in its religious context, submits to Allah. Muhammad is the last of the prophets, the seal of the prophets. So various groups around the world, according to Islam, everyone had their prophet. And the last of the prophets was Muhammad. The Qur'an is the most important book in Islam. It's we think of the Qur'an as the Muslim version of the Bible. Very different views of revelation. In the Bible, we believe that human authors were inspired by God to write. So Luke is sitting down to write. He's inspired by God. The Qur'an, people were not inspired to sit down and write the word of God. The Qur'an is supposedly the eternal word of Allah in heaven with Allah. It was revealed to human beings who had no input into it other than copying it and transmitting it. But the Qur'an also commands Muslims to obey Muhammad, the teachings and example of Muhammad. And since the Qur'an isn't by Muhammad, you have to go outside the Qur'an to get the teachings and example of Muhammad. And that's found in other collections, mainly what are called the hadiths. And the hadiths are these massive multi-volume collections of stories on different topics. So they're usually arranged topically, so it will include everything Muhammad said about fighting, another section on everything Muhammad said about your wives, and so on. And so you get Muhammad's teachings and example. So those are the basic terms. I think that's all we need for now. Note, again, Islam means submission, and to see how important this is, look at 2 Quran verses here. Chapter 3, verse 36 of the Quran. It is not fitting for a believer, man or woman, when a matter has been decided by Allah and His Messenger, to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed on a clearly wrong path. Notice, not fitting for a believer to have once Allah and Muhammad have decided something, to have any option about their decision. So, it's not, hey, I think he really meant this, and maybe I'll do this or that. Chapter 4, verse 65. But know by your Lord they can have no faith until they make you, O Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them, and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and accept them with full submission. So you can have no faith, no real Islamic faith, until you make Muhammad judge in all disputes. Find in yourself no resistance against what Muhammad decides, and you accept it with full submission. So, important to note here, Islam means submission, and Muslim preachers will say, aha, you believe in submitting to God, don't you? Christian? Jew? Jews and Christians will say, if you're talking about submitting to God, of course we want to submit to God. But Islam doesn't just tell you that you must submit to God, it tells you how you submit to God. And you submit to God by unquestioningly obeying Muhammad's decisions. Notice, you accept Muhammad's decisions with full submission. So, you submit to Allah by submitting to Muhammad, right? At least in part. You have Allah's words, but you also submit to Muhammad. Now, how do you do that? Well, fortunately, the commands of Allah and Muhammad have been condensed into a couple easy lists. So we have the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the basic practices. So there's a list of basic practices, and there's a list of basic beliefs or doctrines. And the list of basic practices, the things you have to do in order to demonstrate your submission to Allah. We have the Shahada, that's the testimony of faith. There's no God but Allah, Muhammad is His messenger. Salat, these are the 5 prescribed daily prayers. We have Zakat, that's giving alms. Fasting, this is usually associated with the month of Ramadan. And the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, travel to Mecca, walk circles around the Kaaba, the cubicle structure, and so on. So these are the basic practices that demonstrate that you have submitted to Allah. And we have the basic beliefs. And this is not just a sort of intellectual assent to. You're not just saying, well, I believe in God. You have to believe what Islam teaches about God. That's what belief in Allah means. You're believing what Islam teaches about Allah. So the 6 articles of faith: belief in Allah, angels, books. Notice it's books, plural. Islam doesn't just teach that the Qur'an is the inspired word of Allah. The Qur'an also teaches that the Torah and the Gospel are inspired books. Prophets, that's plural too. Muhammad's just the last prophet. Other prophets, plenty of other prophets. Many prophets that we're familiar with in the Bible. The Day of Judgment and predestination. So those are the basic beliefs and practices that would demonstrate that you are a true Muslim. Now, notice so far, how would Islam be different from any other religion? Yes, it's different, maybe some different beliefs and practices here, but as far as a religion being a collection of beliefs and practices, that's pretty much every religion out there. Right? As Christians, we believe there are certain Christian practices that we have to follow, and there are certain beliefs that things that we have to believe in. So how is Islam different? Well, you do have some commands that sound like you're supposed to fight over these things. For instance, chapter 9, verse 29 of the Qur'an: fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So, fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day. Remember, those were 2 of the 6 articles of faith. You have to believe in Allah and the Day of Judgment. And so here it's fight over people not believing in those articles of faith. Similar with the 5 pillars. Sahih Muslim. Sahih Muslim is a collection of hadiths. It's one of the 2 most respected in Sunni Islam. The Messenger of Allah said, I have been commanded to fight against people till they testify that there is no God but Allah, that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah, and they establish prayer and pay zakat, and if they do it, their blood and property are guaranteed protection on my behalf, except when justified by law, and their affairs rest with Allah. So, notice, Muhammad doesn't say, I've been commanded to fight people in self-defense, or I've been commanded to fight people who are attacking the Muslim community. He does say things like that elsewhere, but right here, he's saying, I've been commanded to fight people until they testify. That's the Shahada. There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah. Establish prayer, that's Salat, 2nd of the 5 pillars, and pay zakat. It's the 3rd of the 5 pillars. So the 5 pillars aren't just a list of practices, they're a list of practices that you fight over under certain circumstances. Now, when we bring these up, the claim is often that, well, there must be something that makes sense of these as applying to some kind of self-defense. Now remember, we quoted the Bible, which, if you took it out of context, would be a straightforward command to go on a killing spree, right? When we look at the rest of the passage, we get a different picture. So the question is, if we look at a bigger picture here, is there something here that would change the meaning of these passages, what they really, really sound like? That really sounds like it's commanding people to fight over the 5 pillars of Islam, right? To fight people until they demonstrate their submission to Allah by carrying out the 5 pillars. That's what it sounds like. Just as the verse before it really sounded like it was a command to fight people based on their beliefs. And so we want to make sure that we're not missing something. So we're going to go ahead and start from the ground up here. We're going to take this step by step from the ground up. So, step number 1 is understand that the Quran claims to be perfectly clear in its commands. When Allah commands you to do something, He's being as clear as He can possibly be. The Quran is Allah's eternal word. Right? You can't say this human author messed up. This is the word of Allah. So, chapter 11, verse 1 of the Quran, this is a book whose verses have been made firm and free from imperfection, and then they have been expounded in detail. 12:1, these are verses of the clear book, 15:1, these are the verses of the book and of a Qur'an that makes things clear. 24:46, certainly we have revealed clear communications. 26:2, these are the verses of the book that makes things clear. These are verses of the Qur'an, a book that makes things clear. These are verses of the book that makes things clear. 28:2. 57:9, he it is who sends down clear communications upon his servant, that he may bring you forth from utter darkness into light. What this means is that if you're reading the Quran and Allah says one thing, and you say, what he really means is this other thing, you'd kind of be claiming to be more clear than Allah in his already perfectly clear book. Now, that doesn't mean, you can, if you just read a verse, then that will be, you'll have a clear understanding. There might be other things involved, like reading the surrounding passage and so on, but once you understand what Allah is saying, there's not a lot of room for reinterpretation here, because if you say what he really meant is such and such, then you're claiming, hey, off the top of my head, I said something more clear than Allah in his perfectly clear word. So, not a lot of room for what Allah really meant here is, not a lot of room for that kind of talk. But there is a problem, namely in that in the Quran, sometimes Allah commands one thing, and sometimes Allah commands something different. And if the Quran is clear, if his commands are clear, why would Allah be telling you to do two different things in different circumstances? So there's a verse of the Quran that says that the penalty for sexual sin is house arrest. There's another verse that says the penalty for sexual sin is 100 lashes. Well, it doesn't seem very clear if Allah is telling you that there's two different penalties for sexual sin. And there's a way to reconcile that, according to the Quran, that makes it still be perfectly clear. And that is the doctrine of abrogation. Chapter 2, verse 106. Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Do you not know that Allah has power over all things? So if you're reading the Quran and there's a command and you understand what the command is saying, you're not changing the context or anything, and this is clearly a command telling me to do one thing, and you read a different passage of the Quran and it's commanding you to do something else, then the appropriate question is, which one came later? It's a very straightforward method of interpretation, not difficult. You go to a list of the Quran, the chronological ordering of the Quran. Keep in mind the Quran is not arranged chronologically as it is when you have a copy of the Quran. You have to look up which passages were revealed when to see which came last. But that's the solution to the Quran commanding different things. Now, so far, that's completely consistent with the Quran being perfectly clear. If Allah is commanding different things, and He gives the solution to that, then the Quran could still be clear. But something happens when we start going to the passages in the Quran that talk about how to interact with unbelievers. We looked at what Jesus and his followers said about how you should interact with unbelievers. You might annoy people as a Christian. You might get on their nerves, but at the end of the day, you were not supposed to fight them or kill them. In Islam, there are teachings. There are teachings that you would look at as a Christian and say, that's a good teaching. But there are other teachings. And just as when we looked at the Bible, the question was, hey, if we read this book from beginning to end, what are the final marching orders for us? What applies to us? You can do the same thing with the Quran. And you can line up all the different passages about interacting with unbelievers, and you get an unfolding revelation. And what you find is that jihad proceeds in stages, depending on the status Muhammad was in the in the community there. And so, what we find, we find this when we look at the life of Muhammad, we find this as we go through the Quran, we find this in the Hadiths. Muhammad is in different situations, and the revelations of the Quran are coming down in response to the different situations that Muhammad was in. And when we line all of those up and put them in order, based on abrogation, we get something like this.